You know, Brian, at first glance, this hinge mortising jig looks kind of complicated with all the knobs and adjustment features that are built in.
You know, once you see how all the parts work together to cut a hinge mortise that fits a hinge perfectly, you can see it's a must-have jig for your shop.
Yeah, and that's especially true when you consider that this one jig will cut a mortise for everything from a little 3/4 inch hinge all the way up to a big 3-inch butt hinge.
You know, to cut a mortise for that range of hinge, or even an ordinary cabinet hinge like this, there's two things you need to control.
Yeah, and that's the width and the length of the mortise.
Now to do that, the jig consists of a 2-part base, an adjustable stop, and a pair of aluminum guide bars.
Plus, there's a fence that allows you to position the jig on your workpiece and clamp it in place securely.
Now, the stop and the guide bars are going to guide the router as you work. You'll go down one guide bar, across the stop, and up the other guide bar to cut the mortise.
And to control those guide bars, they fit into a couple of grooves, as well as a wide rabbet that's cut in the base and in the adjustable stop. Plus, there's a dado that receives the fence.
Now, it could be a bit of a challenge to cut all that in all these individual parts. Instead, I like to start with a single blank.
Yeah, that makes it a whole lot easier to work with, and it ensures that all those cuts are going to line up precisely.
Right, now I got a little bit of work to do, so I'm going to head to the table saw. Now, the first step on working on the blank is to cut a dado in the bottom of the blank to accept the fence. Now, to do that, I already have a dado blade set up in my table saw for a 3/4 inch wide cut, and I've set the height to match the 1/8 inch deep dado. Now, to position it on the edge of the blank, I've positioned my rip fence a 1/2 inch from the blade. Now, my blank's already cut to size, so I'm ready to cut the dado. Well, that takes care of the dado in the bottom of the blank for the fence. Now, there's a couple other cuts I need to make, and that's 2 grooves in the top of the blank. Now, those grooves are going to house this aluminum guide bar, so they need to be cut wide enough to match. Now, to make that cut, I can use the setup I already have on the table saw. A 3/4 inch wide dado blade, and it's set for that 1/8 inch deep cut, which is half the thickness of the guide bar. Now, the only real change I've made, I've adjusted the rip fence to cut the grooves 2 1/4 inches in from the inside edge. One other thing, I'll need to make 2 passes to cut the groove to width. Well, Dave, it was some pretty quick table saw work.
And that takes care of both the grooves plus the dado for the fence. But we still need a way to lock the base pieces and adjustable stop in place.
You know, that's not a problem. I already took care of that with a series of slots for the knob and a hole for a threaded insert.
And with those done, we can go ahead and cut the blank into its individual parts. The first one to cut free is the small base, and I'll take care of that over at the bandsaw. I just guide the edge of the blank against the bandsaw fence. Then I make my first cut. Now I make an intersecting pass to cut the small base free. Well, Brian, that takes care of cutting that small base free.
Still have a little work to do, though. We need to create this wide rabbet on the blank, and to do that, I'm just going to take this area here down to the depth of the groove. Now, creating the wide rabbet here at the edge of the blank is just a matter of removing this waste, and since my table saw is already set up from cutting the grooves earlier, all I need to do is make multiple passes and use my miter gauge to provide support for the workpiece. Well, Dave, didn't take too long at the table saw to create that wide rabbet, and while I was at it, ripped off a thin strip off the back to create the adjustable stop.
Yeah, it really works great. And now we can cut those aluminum guide bars to length, screw one to the adjustable stop, and the other one to that small base.
And now you can see all that work we did with the joinery and starting with the large blank ensures that everything lines up just right.
It's really slick. So now all we got to do is take care of making the fence.
Now the fence, just a piece of hardwood. It's got some threaded inserts at each end.
And then the base fits onto the fence using that dado that we cut.
And then you can lock it in place with a threaded knob. Now, if you'd like to see a free video on installing threaded inserts, go to our website at woodsmithshop.com.
Well, that takes care of the jig. Got one more piece to make, and that's a custom base plate for the router.
Now, the thing about this jig is it's designed around a 4-inch square base plate and a 1/4-inch diameter bit. Now, you could use a straight bit, but I like to use a spiral down-cut bit. Just minimizes chip out along the edge of the mortise.
And then you need to custom cut the opening in the jig to fit that base plate and the bit that you choose.
And that's just a matter of opening up the stops and locking them down in the full open position.
Now, to route that opening, I'm going to need to make several progressively deeper passes. To make it easier, I'm going to lock the jig into the vise. Okay, I've got the jig tightened down into the vise, and I've set the router bit for a shallow cut. Now I'm going to route the opening by moving clockwise. I'll push the router base against the first guide bar and draw the router back until the base plate hits the adjustable stop. Now I push the router over until the base plate hits the next guide bar. Then push the router out along the guide bar until the bit exits the base. Okay, now all I need to do is adjust the bit depth and make a couple more passes until I get all the way through the base. Well, Brian, you can see I went ahead and routed that opening and routed away the waste in that center section of the fence. So now all we need to do is zero out the adjustable stop, and we'll be able to set the width of the mortise.
Right, now that's a pretty simple task. We're just going to use the router and the bit we already had. Now I just want to slide that up until it makes contact, and just rotate the bit a little bit until it's just kissing that front edge, and then slide the adjustable stop up against the base plate.
I'll go ahead and throw a clamp on there to hold that stop in place, and then can use a scratch awl to go ahead and mark that zero line right across the guide bar.
You know, with that scribe mark in place, using this jig is pretty simple.
Yeah, it really is, but before we use it, we need to go ahead and lay out the location of the hinges.
Now, you really only need to mark out one line, but I like to mark out both ends of the hinge so I know exactly where the waste area is.
Then we're going to use that one layout line, bring the jig in, and align the edge of the opening with that line, and we can go ahead and clamp the jig in place.
Now we use the hinge to set the length of the mortise. I'm just going to set that in place in the opening. Then if you could slide that small base up against the end and lock it down, we're good to go.
We can use the hinge also to set the width of the mortise without any measuring. Most of the time, the width is going to equal the distance from the edge of the hinge to the center of the knuckle. So I'll just align the center of the knuckle with that zero line, and then I can slide the adjustable stop into place and lock it down.
All that's left now is to set the depth of cut.
And when you do that, you do need to account for the thickness of the jig base.
That's right. So I saved a scrap, same thickness as the jig base. I'll just set that on the base plate, set my hinge in place, and use that to set the depth of cut. And in this case, it matches the thickness of the hinge leaf.
Well, with that, we're set to actually route that hinge mortise. I'll put the router against the guide bar and turn it on, and pull back against the stop. Slide the router over to the other guide bar and push it back forward. Now I can complete the mortise by routing away the waste with passes from back to front until all the waste is removed. And there you go, just like that, that mortise is routed.
You know, we've got nice, crisp, clean edges here. And as far as the fit goes, looks pretty good except for those rounded corners at the back.
Yeah, well, you know, a round router bit can't cut a square corner, so you're going to have to cut it square with a chisel. Nice thing is, the jig acts as a nice guide for that end cut. Then you just make the other cut. Well, with the corners squared up, let's check the fit.
Grab the hinge here. Well, that's a pretty good fit, Dave. And now we can cut that other hinge mortise, or another dozen if we need to.
And know that they'll be perfect every time.
Woodsmithplans.com. Hundreds of professional, high-quality woodworking plans right at your fingertips. Every single plan is presented as an easy-to-download digital package that includes pages of step-by-step instructions, full-color photos, illustrations, and exploded views, retail sources for hardware and supplies, plus a cutting diagram and materials list. Many plans offer handy video overviews and guides. Plus, we're proud to offer our plans in both standard and metric. Everything is here, from gorgeous heirloom furniture projects to handy shop projects and upgrades, clever, cost-effective storage solutions, as well as weekend projects and accessories that are great for gifts, all fully searchable and categorized for easy browsing. Woodsmithplans.com, everything you need for building fine woodworking projects.